Okay, all right. Another random event by your host, the randomizer. What a day, what a night. And right now it's about 8:42 p.m. coming from Philadelphia, and night is starting to fall. And when night falls, all strange things can happen, right? But one of the things that we see at night, but we don't see in the day, well, at least some people, anyways, are ghosts. That's right, ghosts. Ghosts, like you can imagine, people that have died, but they still appear, the apparitions. I think that's what it's called. Some people see them, some people don't. Some people recognize them as relatives, long lost or short lost, and other people see them as historical figures or people that have lived there somehow, after they check whatever they have to check, the histories of stuff. I've always been fascinated by ghosts when I was little, and even in my adult life, well, early adult life. And, there are a couple of things that I always found interesting. I guess that's part of the whole eerie nature of things. You know, um, the ghost is glowing, and then it's kind of like that eerie kind of feeling. And I always used to kind of wonder, why do ghosts glow? But then it hit me that, well, from in many accounts, people see ghosts at night, right? And so if they didn't glow, you wouldn't see them. And so once that practical nature of how ghosts or how people describe ghosts you know, are said, how then I realized that okay, maybe this whole ghost thing is maybe just ghost of convenience. You know, in a sense that people have a certain idea and it manifests as ghosts. Now, don't get me wrong. There are people that believe in this stuff. They believe in the ghost, and for them, it's as real. You can watch countless documentaries or quasi documentaries or fakeumentaries, whatever you want to call it, right? But there are accounts by people who sincerely believe that, in fact, there is another realm. And actually, let's talk about this for a second. So, ghosts are supposed to live in another plane. Now, the first question you would ask, what does that even mean? Another plane? And the answer you would get is not here. That's basically what it is. So it's like if all that we know, all that we see is considered a plane, then the ghost lives in another plane, which essentially means not here. Because if we can't see the other plane, we have no idea that's where the ghosts are from. But what the person is trying to convey is that it's not from here. So that's another kind of like a wishy-washy kind of thing um, about ghosts, right? But let's look deeper into this stuff, right? I mean, because I'm just kind of fascinated by it, or how people come to the conclusion that there is some truth to it. Because I mean, I'll be honest, there is a possibility for it to be true, but I think it's highly unlikely simply because it's not because that I know everything or I don't know a whole lot. But what my and let's go a little step back real quick, because this is part of the thing that I use. I think everybody should use this in how to analyze what's true and what's not true. And hold on for a second, there's a call coming in. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Had to take care of a phone call. Anyway, where were we? Ghosts. Yeah. Okay, so I guess so. People believe in the existence of these entities, and if you look at the explanation of why they exist, and that's where things become very interesting, right? As I stated earlier, ghosts or spirits are in another plane, as people say, and another plane is basically not here. Because one of the things that you'll notice, people never describe what this. Uh, because I mean, if we equate plane with world, so the ghosts live in another world, another plane, because we live in one plane, whatever. But the thing is, this plane, or I'm just going to call it world from now on. This world is another place. It's another place that has, well, this is an assumption, but this is an assumption that has to be taken. It's a world that must have features. Well, as a matter of fact, actually, I take it back. It's not even an assumption. It has to have features. Everything that we perceive as reality must have features. Features is what differentiates the this one entity from another. Something without feature is not a thing, right? So, some people might talk about, well, what about space? You know, suffice, I mean, even ignoring the fact that space is not empty because it has subatomic particles, and not to mention, I mean, we live in space, so obviously space is not empty. But let's just go with the general idea of if you have like a cubic meter of space, it's empty. But here's the thing. If space is empty, then that is the feature of space. And if that is the feature of space, that means everything else that's empty will also equate it as space. You know? So in order for it to be something else, it can't be empty because whatever empty is considered to be space. So this realm must have some feature, even if it's these ghosts themselves, right? It must have some feature, right? Because actually, I take that back. Not even if it's the ghosts themselves, it must have some feature, and that feature has to be whatever thing that it must have, which allows the ghost to 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 move from that world into our world, right? That feature must exist in that other world. The ability to move to this world, and also the ability to not be seen by this world. But here's the thing, though: when people describe spirits in the realm, they never talk about any of that stuff. So now I've just given you the bare minimum of what this other plane or world must be, but that's like the absolute minimum. That's not even practical. Because here's the thing: when it comes to ghosts and spirits, we're dealing with humans. And one of the things that makes the ghosts and spirits relevant is the fact that these entities, although not quite human, retain a lot of human capability. So if that's the case, then that begs the question. We as humans have lots of needs, desires, not, and wants and all that good stuff. So forget about needs, but we have desires, thoughts, and those things affect what we see around us, and also affects how we build our world. So if ghosts are in fact um, humans that are long gone, that have died, and the spirits from within moves on, well, in order for that spirit to be a human spirit, because remember, at this point, there is no form, so the body is irrelevant. But what connects the spirit to the human It's the are the thoughts, the desires, the wants, and maybe even sometimes the needs. So the spirit must possess those. So now, if the spirit possessed those kind of things, the question then becomes, well, okay, what, uh, how are those needs, desires, and other human-like factors taken care of in the spiritual realm? Are there spiritual houses? Are there, spiritual soulmates? Are there spiritual meals? Are there spiritual pain in this other realm? Nobody ever asked that question. We get tired. Does the spirit get tired? And if the spirit doesn't sleep or get tired, what does the spirit do in its time? Well, with its time, that brings us to another question. Is time the same as ours in the spiritual realm? And then here's my favorite. Many times, even though the spirit has no physical form, when people see spirits or when they describe what they've looked at, the spirit always has clothes on. One of the best things one of the interesting things that I had a friend of mine tell me was when he remembered seeing the ghost of his dead grandmother out the window when it was raining. Okay? But it also, when I asked him to this, because I was just trying to test out a hypothesis of mine. So when I asked him, I said, did your grandmother have a raincoat on? And he said yes. Now, why would a ghost have a raincoat? Or why would a ghost appearance reflect the environment that we see when in fact they're on another plane, A, and B, they're not affected, by things in this world. That's why they presumably can go through walls and stuff. So that's an interesting thing right now. So you take all of that, and then you start to see that at least, like spirits and ghosts may be real, but the way to describe has a lot to be desired. Like it just doesn't sound right. You'll hear people talk about, the ghost of my aunt, or actually, I went into this. This is not my story, but I'm just giving a figurative. I'm just giving an example. I go into this house that I just bought, and in the basement, when I go into the basement, I keep hearing like sounds of chains rattling around, and then I see in the corner these chain, like a chain, and it's moving around, it's moving all over the place, and so I run out of the basement because I'm scared. And then later on, I found out that slaves back 300 years ago, 400 years ago, they used to have slaves in the basement. So, see, the slaves, the souls of the slaves are the ones that are moving the chain. And people are like, oh yeah, that's scary. It is scary if that was the case, don't get me wrong. But then it's like, but why would the slaves move the chain? What effect? What does the slave get? What does the ghost slave get out of it? Because presumably the whole point is to communicate. And if this is the way you're communicating, unless there's some ulterior motive, you figure if the ghost can move the chain, that means the ghost can interact with physical objects. That means that the ghost can at least write. Right now, you may argue, well, a lot of the slaves, and remember, this is just an example, but people will still might want to argue and say, well, slaves in those days couldn't write. But it's not like slaves are the only ghosts that exist. But let's just go with that, just because it's fun. It's like, okay, that's fine, but they can draw, right? So you figure if the slave really wants to communicate, they would make it very, very easy to communicate. And not to mention, you figure I mean, if it was 400 years ago, the slave ghost had 400. It's been around for at least 400 years plus however long they're actually alive. So that's enough time to study the way people behave, the way this culture behave, and I'm almost certain you give me 400 years and I can learn any language. I can learn to read, write, speak, and listen in any language if you give me 400 years. So by now, the spirit shouldn't have to rely on cryptic messages. But that's what we get, right? And then so finally, on this spirit stuff and ghost, here's the thing. I cannot say whether or not these people saw what they claim. I mean, if they think it was there, then that's fine. It is there. But anybody should always question how what they perceive as real lines up with other things that they perceive as also real. Like basically, no matter what the world, in order for us to function properly, there cannot be contradictions in how the world operates. Why? Because if there's contradictions in the world operates, that means the world operates in just more or less uh, uh, un, undiscernible or indiscernible. I'm not too sure which one is the exact word, but it operates in a way that we cannot make any assumption about it, which means that we cannot function. It's kind of like I'm walking down the street. Any step I take, I could fall through. I could fall through the planet and end up in some other place of the world. And if somebody says, "Well, that's impossible," well, I haven't stepped on that new piece of sidewalk just yet, as I'm walking forward. So, but I'm making assumptions about it, and once I start making assumptions about it, then I am basically saying there's an order to this world, and that's the only way we operate, because that's the only way that makes sense. So therefore, if we come across contradictions, even if we have personal experience with a particular thing, we should question it, because 99.99% of the time, there is something wrong with the way we are concluding, because ultimately the world is always consistent. And if it's not consistent, that means that we're not reading it correctly. So then something's got to break. So I'll leave you with this one thing, last thing on ghosts. And that is, if ghosts were real, we as human beings, we spend a whole lot of money to be able to have a reliable communication. Why? Because ghosts would be a security risk for every single government around the globe. Why? Ghosts can go through walls. Ghosts are not detected by infrared, motion sensor, ultrasonic, gamma rays. They're not detectable by any technology that we have. So if we can communicate with them, the powers that be will figure out however way they can to satisfy the desire of ghosts, if they have one. They'll figure it out just for them to be able to go into the power centers of adversary countries and just sit there and listen. They can't be detected. And even if they could be detected, they can't be dealt with. So the ghost can actually appear in, let's just say for America, in a White House or at the Pentagon, once again for America, in the ultra secret meeting. And people will have a choice to either not talk or at some point just have to talk because they can't get rid of the ghost. So the ghost will be employed by the most powerful countries of the world, and basically they'll put spies out of business. We're not seeing that, so there's a good chance that ghosts don't exist. right? Um, but that would definitely compromise everything if they did, because certain things need to be kept secret, right? But that's the but in a way that's like an interesting kind of thing, and also a good pivoting point about the government keeping things secret. Because in a democracy, at some point, you can't just say everything out loud, because when you say everything out loud, not only are your citizens listening, but your adversaries are also listening. So certain things must be kept secret in a democracy, right? So there are certain things that the people don't have the right to know, and the don't have a say in what happens, right? So once we get to that point, this is the pivot now, because it's not about ghosts anymore. It's about democracy and secrecy, which is where we left up from the ghost. So when it comes to that, the secrecy, every democracy picks and choose what is considered to be public info and public has a say, and they don't. But but if you really think about it, that is one big giant loophole in the democratic system of for the people by the people, that you can drive a, a rocket through, or a freight train lengthwise, because it could be used for anything that you don't want the public or or the people that's to have control of. That's the whole thing about for the people by the people, right? I mean, we see it in many countries when they don't want to release certain information. The claim is because of national security, and the thing is, it's kind of hard to question that when the very questioning itself could be a national security, and that stuff is legit. That can happen, and it does happen. But the point is, it's hard to tell whether or not it is legit, because it could be used for everything. So essentially, what we're doing, we're trusting it. We're trusting the powers that be to not abuse it. And if it is abused, you'll either find out decades later, years later, that it is what it is. And sometimes people would have to may end up going to jail for their life, like Julian Assange, for example, in 2022, for releasing such information. So all this stuff got me thinking once again, because I do think every so often that so what's this? This democracy has so many exceptions to it, and these exceptions, their enforcement changes over time. But the important thing that I've noticed, especially over the last 6 months, is that when the brown stuff hits the fan, the amount of leeway goes down. Restrictions increase just to get the public back on page, as they would say. So then the question is this democracy for the people by the people, governments are accountable to the people, seems like it has so many loopholes that that the government is accountable to the people by choice, right? So if we go down that line of thinking, which I certainly am, then it's like, okay, so what's the whole point of all this? Because this is no different than a lot of other forms of government that are not by the people. Because ultimately, if the government has the authority to determine when it's by the people and when it's not, then maybe it was never by the people. So I came across a while back, I think maybe a couple of years ago, I think an article, or maybe it was do I even dare say a YouTube comment, but whatever it was, I forget. That basically the point of the voting by the people, um, for the people, and this democratic thing initially was a way for one group of wealthy oligarchs, if you want to call them that, or actually, based on what I've read a while back, it was a way for the oligarchs, all of them, was a way for them to take power away from the king or the monarch, right? But it wasn't really about giving it to the people. But the fact that there are more people than oligarchs, ultimately, at the end of the day, and I always tell people this, no matter what kind of governing system you've got, ultimately, when things really, 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 really get bad to the point where the public has nothing to lose, they will always take over a government. Or at least they will not even take, they will displace the government, right? Because at the end of the day, people, because the ultimate punishment you can give people is deny them to do things. And that can only be guaranteed through death. So if they don't even fear that, then there's nothing you can do to stop them to try to achieve their methods, right? Every government knows that. And that's one of the reasons because at some point the enforcement requirement, right? Because if you need to enforce things on people, it's going to cost the government because you need people to enforce things on people, and the people that are going to do the enforcement, at the very least, they need to be better off than the people that So the mechanism, the people that do the actual oppression, not the leaders that give the orders, but the man on the ground, right? That actually does the oppression. The man on the ground that storms the house. The man on the ground that does the beating. That is, the police force, the army, the guards. Those people, at the very least, need to be paid better or treated better than the people they're beating down. Because if that's not the case, then what's in it for them? Because, like I said earlier, even fear is not going to make, one person beat down another person knowing there's going to be a retaliation from, let's say, 100 people if there's no additional benefit. So that means that the more people you have to suppress physically, because I don't, all this doesn't really matter. Because ultimately it comes down to physically. Physically happens when the oppressed have nothing to lose. You need to put them down or keep them under control. When that starts to happen, the government has to spend resources on that. And at some point, the resource they need to put out is just too much to keep the public at bay. And in that case, the government can't do it, and the government folds. Right? So governments, or the authority. So I don't want to say government because we're going back in the day. So the king can no longer, have the control. But so what people do, smart rulers, kings and stuff, they'll give you a little something something. They give the people a little something something. So that way, whatever little something that the general public has, it may not be a whole lot, but they certainly don't want to lose it for this pie in the sky idea of being even more free. So a lot of times those people don't join the rebellion. They'll be oppressed, but but they'll be oppressed, but they still have something to lose, so they won't rise up necessarily. And the king is happy, and the ruling group of people are happy, and so on and so forth. So that's the king, and that's back in the day. I don't know, feudal era, whatever, 1400s, 1300s, whatever, not. But then you have the oligarchs, right? The other people that are kind of wealthy, but they got a lot of money because they got a lot of peasants and farms and fields and landlords, and they own a whole bunch of people, but they still cannot compete with the power of the king, because the king still has the ultimate power, at least according to the way the structure works out. So this hypothesis that I've read somewhere and that I agree with is that these oligarchs, landlords like in the actual term, like land, not buildings, as we use it today. They come up with this idea of convincing the people that they should try to break through, and ultimately, maybe even give them some I don't want to, support, whether it's not through weapon, money, shelter, location, to be able to voice their opinion, and everybody should have the right to determine what should happen to their land or to their country. And yes, I'll be the first person to say that totally makes sense, and it appears to be a better system. But I'll always say to some extent. However, when this idea is being sold by the oligarchs, this is like back in the day, now, not the landlords, landowners. It was like an absolute thing that people shouldn't, push you around, and this should be a nation or a country or whatever you want to call it, or a tribe, whatever it is. Everyone should have to be able to participate in how they're governed. And like I said, it makes sense on the surface, but only to some extent. But that extent is not told to the people, because nobody wants to be limited, right? Everybody wants to just do whatever they want to do. So anyway, so the landowners, they sell this idea, and it totally makes sense, and the people buy into it, and then now the people go against the king. But from the landowners, that was their whole point all along. It's not about the people, but the need to use the people as a vehicle to get to the king, right? And yes, there's a little price to pay, because the people might kind of turn against them. But it's like with everything else. If 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 I have, let's say, 40% power, and the king's got 60% power, right? I mean, as a group, I got 60% power, and I mean, I got 40% power, and the king's got 60% power. Now, if my little scheme works out, 80% of the time, I'll have 90% power. And then at some point, there's a chance that I may not have power, but that's 20%. That's a risk worth taking, because in that 80% probability that chance that I have power as time goes on, I have 90% of control now. 90% versus the 20% where, let's say, I have none, or 5%. So you're willing to do that. But now, how do you go ahead in this thing where people, participate in the government? How do you make sure that, yes, you dispose of the king, so now the people make the decision? But how do you make that? How do you make sure? How do you engineer in such a way that the people will just kind of like you, or do your bidding, right? And that's where I think the guys from the early days, they realized the flaw of society en masse, right? Like when you have a whole lot of people around, and especially as things get, especially the fact that a lot of people just, not by their own doing, but just by the way things are set up back then, and definitely now, it's hard to to get all the information that you need to make a judgment of whether or not person X is qualified to lead. But even better than that, these people from back in the day, up to to now, so I also start calling them oligarchs now. They know that people get very emotional. So if you throw a lot of emotional stuff in front of them, they may fall for the emotional stuff and not see the bigger picture. I mean, because this is what happens with most people, right? It's like it's with the everyday life that people have to struggle with. They don't have time to see the bigger picture, so they will just go on what somebody they trust, and a lot of times it's through emotions, that person will do the right thing, and that's where the oligarchs and stuff come in. So the power is given to the people, right? But with a giant flaw. It's kind of like somebody telling you, "Hey, let's use this new secure software." yes, the software is secure, except that there's a back door, right? And so I then now have the power, the control to determine whether or not the software works as advertised or whether I exploit the bug whenever I feel like my position in society is threatened. And so that's what democracy has become today, for most part, right? It doesn't matter what country you're talking about, whether you're talking about Russia, Germany, France, U.S., Nigeria, whatever Turkey, however way you want to, slice it, dice it, right? That, we're all humans, and that emotional part is still there. And so, what the oligarchs have achieved is that, and actually, a reason why a lot of countries, especially the U.S., loves democracies is because they have a back door, right? They've discovered a bug in the system that apparently a lot of people don't think it exists. So as long as the bug doesn't exist, as long as the user of the software doesn't realize there's a bug in the software, they'll accept it. And so democracy is that case. It's a software with a 0 day exploit or bug. I think that's what it's called. It's a software with a so far unfixable bug that a lot of people don't know about. So because they don't know about it, they'll accept it. Yeah, I take that. I take the democracy. It's good because I want to be secure. I want to make sure that I have a say, which is always a good thing. But with that bug, it could be as bad as an authoritarian state, as long as the people that can exploit that bug, whenever they feel like doing it, they can do it. And so, in a way, it's worse than an authoritarian state because in an authoritarian state, the government is authoritarian. When they do something harsh that you don't like, they're doing it. But going back to the bug, the bug software bug analogy, you know, if that bug happens in the software, you don't know why it's happening. You don't blame the software necessarily because you don't know what's going on. So therefore, you may still accept it and say, "Oh man, the reason why this is not working is probably because my internet service provider, or maybe I have it shut down. My computer shut down because there was a power surge, but it could have been like a power surge initiated by the bug in your software. But you don't know that, so you still keep using the software, and the person that's taking advantage of this bug has a field day whenever they want. So you'll never blame the software provider while they're still messing up your day, to choose a polite word. Um, at the same time, the authoritarian, you know what's up. You know the guy's evil. You know the guy's authoritarian. So there is no delusion about what is happening. You stay out of their way. You don't support them, and you definitely don't try to make your family member use them. But in the democracy thing, that's what's happening. People don't want to see that bug. They don't want to see that flaw. And what do? They promote it all around the world, which would be great if it didn't have that huge, giant train going sideways loophole. But it does. People don't see it. And so, in my book, that the democratic system is just as dangerous as the authoritarian. And the only silver lining in between the two is the democracy with the giant hole train goes sideways bug is fixable. Meanwhile, the authoritarian is not. And I think, once again, I had some other stuff that I was going to talk about, but now we're to the 40-minute mark, so I am just done. And it's hot. So, I think this was I kind of like this conversation, another random event by the randomizer on this July 16th, 2022.